for mora, there's a difference when they're moist, and then there's a difference when they are dry, on a Torah level, rabbinic level. The Gemara stated that these vegetables, if you place them as a ceiling, as a cover on top of let's say there's a dead body, and there's a space of a certain space, so let's say a tefach, certain space, and then after you have the certain space, you place these vegetables as some sort of cover, right? So we said that these vegetables, on a Torah level, these vegetables could serve as a cover, as a tent. And since they serve as a tent, good morning, Jaime. We have someone is asking a question about yesterday's Gemara, so we're just clarifying something from yesterday's Gemara. The Gemara said that if you have these vegetables, which are very thin, and when they dry out, because they're very thin, they dry out, they start disintegrating, and they fall, some pieces will actually fall off. So the rabbis are concerned that if you're gonna rely on these vegetables to be a cap on a cap over, let's say if there's something, a dead body over here, and this is above it, might rely on this as a cap to stop any contamination to go above. So the rabbi said, we're concerned, you can't use that as a cap, because this type of material is gonna get holes in it when it dries up, and therefore the only way it would be a cap if it would remain on a Torah level. It's a cap when it's moist, because there's no hole on top. It's thick, not thick, but it's whole. Because it's whole, it will act as a cap above what's the dead body that's underneath. But once it dries out and pieces start falling off from it, it no longer could serve as a cap to stop the contamination from going above, because there's a hole in the cap. That's what we said regarding the contamination. But we also said that if this canopy of vegetables that's above has on one side the dead body underneath, and the other side of these vegetables there's the utensil, there is food, that other food would also become susceptible to contamination because it's under this cover. And the last thing we said yesterday, when we were up to yesterday, is we said in a sukkah, there are certain laws regarding a schach. When you have schach that's unfit schach, not appropriate cover for the sukkah, and right, because vegetables have the ability to become contaminated. Because they have the ability to become contaminated, they're not kosher schach. So you would have thought that it should have a rule, if you would place these vegetables as schach to fill in gaps in your sukkah, to place it, morning, Ariel, if you made it as schach, you might have thought it would have the same ruling as non-kosher schach, right? You would say, like you said, Mr. Betesh, it's susceptible to contamination. So the rule is something that's susceptible to contamination is not kosher schach. Our bamboos are not susceptible to contamination, but food is susceptible to contamination. It's not kosher schach. We have certain laws of not kosher schach. And there's an interesting thing that we are more, we'll see more in the Gemara as we get there. There's a stringency regarding an open area. It's easier to invalidate a sukkah with an open space, a certain size of an open space, than a certain size of not kosher schach. So there's a certain amount of open space in a sukkah that could invalidate, that could cut the sukkah in half, that could separate the sukkah. It's also a certain amount of open space that would make it that you're not allowed to sit under that spot in the sukkah. There's a certain amount of not kosher schach that could split a sukkah in half, and a certain amount of not kosher schach that you would not be able to go ahead and sit under that schach. in the sukkah. So, and so you might have thought that these vegetables will be treated like not kosher schach, which the amount is a larger. In order to invalidate the sukkah, to split the sukkah in half, it has to be, let's say, 4 tfachim in general. You need four hands breadths, 4 tfachim. Let's say we'll call it around 15 inches of not kosher schach. That if you have 15 inches by 15 inches, you wouldn't be able to sit under that spot in the sukkah. It has the ability to split the sukkah in half if it goes from wall to wall. But if it's an empty space, less than that, 3 tfachim, 11 inches by 11 inches. If you have an empty space going across the whole sukkah, that could split the sukkah in half. So what the Gemara is saying over here is we're giving these vegetables the stringency as if it's open area. We're treating these vegetables as if it's open space. Now, why are we treating these as open space? Because the fact that it's going to fall, disintegrate, break up because of its thinness of the vegetables. When it dries out, it's going to, let's say, throughout the, over the holiday, over the 7 days of the holiday, it's going to dry up. Therefore, we give it the stringency of, and we consider it as if it's open space. And therefore, you have to treat it. If we see someone has such a sukkah, we're going to say, you know what? We're going to treat it as an open space because that's what's going to happen. It's going to get open. So instead of waiting till it gets open and people are going to start, comes day 1 of Sukkot, the person's going to say, oh, you're treating it like a 4 tfachim space. It has to be 4 tfachim to invalidate it. But comes the 5th day of Sukkot, they're going to be sitting under the same thing, and they're going to think they have up to 4. Since it's less than 4 tfachim, it's good. But really, by the time the 5th, 6th day comes about, it's already open. They don't realize it's already open. It's opened a significant amount on that area. So therefore, the rabbis, in order to ensure that people won't make a mistake and treat it like not kosher schach, the rabbis gave it a status of open area, open space. So that clarifies that point. Okay, now we're going to a new point in the Gemara. And that's what the Gemara means when the Gemara says, this is the bottom of 13b1. Poslim besukkah mishum avir. Good morning, Dr. Rosen. It invalidates the sukkah as open space. We treat it like open space. My timer. What's the reason? Since when they dry up, they crumble and they fall down, and then they're no longer there. Command lesu dummy. We treat it as if it's not there, and therefore we treat it as open space. Okay, now we're going to continue in the Gemara. We are now on 13b2 on the left column. V'omar Rav Abba Amar Rav Huna. Rav Abba says in the name of Rav Huna, Habotze Lagas, somebody who cuts the grapes. What purpose is he cutting the grapes? Now, people cut grapes for either I'm going to eat the grapes, or you're going to cut grapes for what purpose? Because you want the wine. And depending on what your purpose of why you're cutting the grapes, Rav Abba says, is whether there will be a handle, whether we'll treat the handle of the grape like the grape itself, or the handle of the grape would not be like the grape itself. That means to say that there's something, we know the grape itself is susceptible to contamination. It's a food, right? Morning you do. The food, and the general rule is by food that once the food has been detached from the ground and has come in contact with certain types of liquid, water or some other liquids, then it has the ability to receive contamination through somebody who's contaminated or some other item that has the ability to contaminate. That's the food. The question is, what about the stem that's connected to the food? If you go ahead and you touch the stem, let's say someone who's tamei touches the stem of the grape, not the grape itself, that stem that's sticking out of the grape, would the grape become contaminated? Well, you say no, he didn't touch the grape itself, he just touched the stem. So in the introduction, in the Masifta, the Gemara, they give a certain introduction to the following our Gemara that we're going to be learning in order to make it easier for us to understand, to give a little background. They say a person, utensils, and food receive contamination by one of the ways is by touching something that's tamei. If I touch something that certain things that are tamei, a person that's tamei, or food could come into contact with something that's tamei, through the direct contact by touching something which is contaminated, will contaminate the item that touches the item. The stem that's attached to a food, and similarly the handle that's attached to a pot, right? It's not the handle, let's say you have the handle, which is not the pot itself. Even though they themselves, let's say the handle itself is not an item it's not a utensil. It's only serving a utensil, right? A utensil is something, let's say a container that you put something inside as a utensil. But here, this is just, it's helping me carry the item. I'm carrying the item through that handle, but it's not itself, it's not the utensil. So even though, and the stem is not the food. The food is the food. The stem is the thing that's attached to the food. If by having the stem attached to the grape, it helps me to hold the food, or similarly, the utensil, it helps me carry the utensil, they become like the utensil itself. They become like the food itself, like tafel, like you go ahead and you have a food that has multiple ingredients. So there's a concept that there's the main ingredients, the most of the ingredients are made from a certain type of food. And so you have, let's say, a cocktail, you have a fruit cup, and everything is mixed together. There's bori priya eitz and there's bori priya dama. You have apples and oranges cut up, and then you have strawberry and pineapple, and majority is one over the other. So you see, you go after the majority. If you're eating them together as one, you go after the majority. The other ones become negligent, secondary to the majority. So here also there's a concept that the handle that's serving the pot, the stem that's serving the food, has a status. We treat it as the food itself. Therefore, if something that's contaminated touches the stem or touches the handle, even though it didn't touch the food itself, but it's as if you touched the food itself. It's as if you touch the utensil itself, and therefore the utensil or the food will contract contamination as a result of merely the stem of the food was contacted the stem, or merely, good morning, Jake, or merely the handle of the utensil. Similarly, if the food was this grape that has the stem was contaminated, and something else that was not contaminated touches the stem, it will also, that item will contract contamination by merely touching the stem. The stem is a conduit that will bring contamination to the food and the utensil. And similarly, the stem, meaning if the food or the utensil, let's say the grape was not contaminated before, But if the stem receives contamination, now the grape will become contaminated. Similarly, if the grape was already contaminated and something touches the stem, it's as if you touch the grape itself that's contaminated and it'll become contaminated. If you cut the grain for the purpose of eating, so the part of that's right next to the grain itself, that part that's next to it is considered a yad. It's considered a handle, because the person wants. We'll see. Rashi will explain later on. Person wants that stuff that's right next to the same way that you want the stem. When you're eating grapes, you want the stem. It's easy for you to handle, easy for transport. You want it. So there's also a desire for the person when you're eating. There's when you're cutting the grain for the purpose of food purposes, you want that area that's right next to the food itself of the grain. And therefore that area that's right next to the food itself would also, it's like a handle, and also will have the same status of the handle that we spoke about, the stem of the grape, would also be similarly by grain. Yeah, we're gonna get how it's gonna be. We're gonna get to the schach, how it's gonna affect schach. Very good. And then we're gonna see in the Gemara that since the handle is dependent on your desire, if you want it to use as a handle, if you're interested or not. So the Gemara is also going to discuss if, let's say, you no longer want it to be attached. And originally you cut it for the purpose of food purposes, and then you changed your mind, you don't need it anymore for food purposes. Let's say you want to use it for schach, Ariel was saying. Then now this question is, does it lose its status as a handle, or doesn't it lose its status as a handle? So that is, now remember, the handle itself, by itself, it will not be susceptible for contamination. If you would just look at the handle, you look at the stem of a grape. The stem of a grape is not food. What is it? It's a little twig coming out of the grape. It's not food. It's not mekabel tumah. It's not susceptible to contamination. But if it has a status of a handle, then it has a status of the food itself that it's attached to, and then it would be susceptible to contamination. And that's what we're going to get into the schach. So that's what the Gemara now, that's a little intro into the Gemara. So now let's start the Gemara inside. On 13b2. V'ama Rav Abba Amar Rav Huna. Rav Abba says, in the name of Rav Huna, Habotzer legat. If you cut the grapes, for what's your intention for cutting the grapes? You weren't interested in eating the grapes. You were only interested in pressing the grapes. You wanted the wine. So there, you're not interested. You're not interested for the stem to be connected to the grapes. It has no purpose for you. You're not eating these grapes that you're going to hold it and carry it by the stem. You want to press the grapes. If you want to press the grapes and you're not interested in these handle, in the stem, say ein lo yodo. And also, by the way, the Gemara is going to say that the handle, it's wood of the grape, it's going to absorb some of the wine when you press the wine. And therefore it's going to take away from the amount of wine that you're going to collect, that you're going to have when you're pressing the grape. So because it's going to take away the piece of wood, that stem is going to take away from the grape, you don't want it, you're not interested in it, it does not have a status of the grape itself. And therefore, if something that's contaminated touches the stem, it's that we look at the stem as if it's independent of the grape itself, and the grape will not become contaminated as a result of something that's contaminated touches the stem. And similarly, if the grape becomes contaminated and something touches the stem of the grape, the item that touches the stem of the grape does not become contaminated because the stem in that situation does not have the law of the grape itself. Okay? Is everything clear, everybody? Everyone's becoming experts in Tumah and Tahara. Is it clear? Again, question is, the handle of an item, does it have the status of the item itself or not? Right? So we're saying over here, it depends. It depends if the handle of the item was there for the purpose that you want the handle or you don't want the handle. If you want the handle, then it's like the item itself. And therefore, whatever status the item has, that will have the same status. Look at it as if it's one. But if you're not interested at all in the handle, then we look at it as two separate entities. Okay? Even though they're connected together, but it's still considered two separate entities if you're not interested. In having it. So that's what the Gemara says. Now comes Rav Menashe bar Gada Rav Huna. Comes Rav Menashe bar Gada named Rav Huna. Good morning, Mr. Silverman. We are on 13b, Yud Gimel and Beis 2. He makes the statement, Hakotzer l'schach. He's cutting the grain for the purpose of schach. He wants to go ahead. Now, remember, you're cutting grain for the purpose of schach. There's two parts. Good morning. There's the grain itself, the food itself, and then there's the stuff that's immediately next to the food, that's covering the food, that's protecting the food. And the food we know is not kosher for schach. The grain itself is not kosher for schach because food is susceptible to contamination. But the stuff that's right surrounding the food, that stuff, we said, depending in general, if you want to eat the grain, you're happy to have that shell, whatever that's they call it the handle of the grain. You want it, so then the handle will have the law of the grain. But here, you're not interested in eating. You cut it for the purpose of schach. So now, what will you say? You would say that most probably it doesn't have a status of a handle because you're not interested in. You're not interested. You don't want it. You don't want the food and the stuff surrounding the food to be attached. You don't want it together because the food in itself is hurting you. The food that's connected, the grain that's connected, we'll call the grain the food part, and we'll have to call whatever you want to call that stuff that's right above the stubble, right? It's right above the grain, is the psolat, is the waste product. For your purposes, it's detrimental to you when you have the grain together with the stubble, because the grain is not kosher for schach. So you don't want them connected. You don't want that. You would rather in a certain sense that they should be disconnected. Because if you have too much grain, too much food product, that would ruin your schach, right? If you have too much, if there's more food than stubble, that would ruin your schach. Because if most of your schach is not kosher schach, and if you have a mixture of kosher schach and not kosher schach, so we're going to go after the majority. So if you have too much food product here, too much grain product, that would be bad for you. So therefore, this opinion says, since you're not interested in the handle, so to speak, you're not interested in the stubble that's directly outside the grain pot, therefore they're considered not connected. When you're not interested in the item, like we just saying, the same way we said, if you're not interested in the handle and the stem of the grape, it doesn't have the same status of the grape. So too, if you're not interested in the stubble that's right outside the ear, the food of the grain, it's not considered like the grain itself. I mean, I rather it being disconnected. Because since I don't want food on top of my sukkah, I don't want a food product, because a food product is not kosher schach. That makes it that it's not, as if it's not. We look at two as right. It's like two separate items. Because I really, if it's food that's connected to something else, the food product is not kosher for schach, and I don't want it there. And because yes, in fact, that two things are separate, right? If we would look at the food, if we would look at the stubble that's around the food of the grain, as if it's like the grain itself, then there's no kosher schach here, because the food part is not kosher schach, and now the whole stubble that's around the food part, if we're gonna treat it like the food itself, then I don't have kosher schach at all here. So comes the rabbi and says, since you cut it for the purpose of schach, you really don't want the food to be here, and therefore it's not susceptible to contamination, the stubble part, and therefore, as long as you have more stubble than the food part, it's kosher. It's a kosher. The schach is kosher. Is everything clear? Anybody have any questions?
So when it's food, it's not good. When it's not food, it's good.
Right. If the status of they write it, they call the stubble the straw. If the straw that's right outside the grain is something that you want to be there with the grain, then it would not be kosher schach, because the straw part would have the status of the food. If you're not interested in the straw being connected with the food, even though they're connected, you're not connected. I don't know if it's like a musar idea. A person could be connected with somebody, but if they're not interested in being connected, they're not connected. You could be attached to somebody, but if you're not interested, you're not connected, even though you're actually connected. So it's the mindset. How do you like that, Jake? It's the mindset. A husband and a wife, they could be connected, but if they have the same house, but if they're not interested, they're not called connected in a certain sense. I don't know if that's the right muscle, but you understand, you have two items they're actually connected. But if you don't want to be there, if you don't want them to be there, they're not there. We don't look at it, we don't look at it as one.
The musar was
something musar idea to think about a little bit.
Excellent.
What? What'd you say, Ariel? Okay. So now the Gemara, now that we have these two statements, the Gemara is going to say that these two rabbis are not agreeing with each other. Now, even though they sound like, each one sounds like they should be in agreement with each other. So listen to what the Gemara said. Man diyoma kotzer, the one who says that if you cut the grain for the purpose of schach, it does not, the straw part does not have status of the grain because you're not interested in it. Kol shekain botzer. Certainly when you cut the grapes, you're definitely not interested in the for the purpose of what? Of pressing the grapes. You're definitely not interested in the twig and the stem being attached to the grape, but it's detrimental to your processing of the squeezing of the grapes. Why? You do not want the stem attached to the grape when you're pressing the grapes. You have no use for the stem. Not only have no use, it hurts you.
It makes it bitter.
But when you eat it, until you eat it, you want to hold it. You want to hold until you eat it. Generally, you want to hold it by the stem, or you have a purpose for it. Why don't you want it when you're cutting it for pressing? The Gemara says, you don't want the stem to absorb some of the wine. It's an absorber. The stem is like a wood piece. It absorbs some of the wine. However, Man di'ama, both says she'en lo yodo. The one who says, the rabbi that says that when you cut the grapes for the purpose of squeezing the grapes for the wine, for pressing the grapes, but he would hold if you cut the grain for the purpose of schach, he would say that the straw would be a handle. Good morning, Boaz. Would be a handle. Why would it be a handle? You told me, didn't we just say you don't want the straw together with the grain because when you're cutting it for schach, the grain is not kosher schach, the grain part, but the nichalein l'sachech behu the kehechi de lo levadron. So one way Tosfos explains is that the heaviness of the having the food pot connected to the stubble, to the straw, helps that the straw doesn't blow away with the wind. So that's how. So therefore, so when I put it on for schach, when I put on the grain with the straw that's connected to the grain. So what's the kosher part for schach? The straw. If the straw would be that technically, if the straw would be separated from the grain, the straw will be kosher schach. The grain will be not kosher. Now that they're connected to each other, I want them to connect. A person has use, has desire that the straw part should be connected to the grain part. Why? Because that one reason Tosfos says, because that's going to help keep it on top of the sukkah. The weight of the food, of the grain, being connected onto the what? It gives a little weight to the straw that's connected around it, and therefore the straw doesn't fly away with the wind. And because I want it to be there, therefore it has a status therefore it's considered that's considered connected. I want them to be connected. I have a desire that they should be there.
It sounds like a case of lishma, like you have to do it for lishma.
Right, but here the point is, if I want the grain and the food part to be connected, then they're considered like one. And
that's lishma.
And if they consider like one, then it's not kosher for schach. So that's what he says. This opinion holds that it's a matter of controversy, two different opinions. If you cut the grain for the purpose of schach, and you have the straw still attached to the grain, will it be considered as if we look at the straw separate from the grain, and therefore you could count the straw part for kosher schach, or whether we'll look at the straw as part of the grain and will not be kosher schach? Two different opinions in the Gemara, and stay tuned for Monday to be continued. I want to wish everyone a beautiful Shabbat. Thank you all for being here, and everything good to everybody. All the best, everybody. Thank you.
Rabbi, we put fruit on the sukkahs. We hang fruit from them.
But you hang fruit as decorations.
I know. I'm just sharing with you. We're remediing this.
Right. But we saw when you see in the Gemara that the Gemara they used pomegranates and other fruits for decorations, but your intention is only for decoration. See, a lot will have to be with your kavanah, because if your intention is for schach, then you're getting into problems, because that's not kosher.
Yeah, the fruit hanging, Michael, is not. It's not schach itself.
I know. Right. I'm just saying we're remediing the Gemara. We're living back in the Gemara, like we're putting the fruit to the tree. We don't have fruit on our schach, but we add the fruit. But
you heard what Jaime said. It's different than the Gemara, because the Gemara is talking about using the food as a schach.
As schach. I got you. I'm just sharing
that's the problem. That's an issue.
I'm just sharing how it remedies.
Yes. There is this connection of food. Yes. Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Bye bye.
Take care. All the best.
Bye, Rabbi.
Take care. Bye bye.